Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to introduce ourselves to muscle tissue. So all different types of muscle that are found in the body convert electrical stimulation into mechanical contractile force. So what we're going to see here when we compare and contrast the three different types of muscle is that the source of electrical stimulation is going to depend on what kind of muscle that we're talking about. To this end, there are three different types of muscle that we will eventually see in much greater detail later in the semester, but for now we're just going to gently introduce them. We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. If we start with skeletal muscle, you, I'm sure, already are aware, skeletal muscle is attached to bone and allows for the movement of the skeleton. This is the reason why we can walk around and do all of the other important things that we do on a daily basis. Skeletal muscle cells, or fibers, receive electrical stimulation from motor neurons, which originate in the central nervous system. Skeletal muscle has histological hallmarks that include striations, each cell containing multiple nuclei, and very much of a bundled structure. So you can see a histological view of what skeletal muscle looks like under the microscope. So what we can see here is that, as I said before, each muscle fiber, which is one muscle cell, tends to contain many nuclei, and that may be a little bit startling for you if you're used to every cell only having one nucleus. So it turns out that there are exceptions to that. The striations that we talked about are due to the special arrangement of the contractile proteins actin and myosin. So the striations refer to kind of the vertical striped lines that you can see both in a single cell and in a zoomed out view of the entire tissue. Later in the semester, when we dedicate an entire chapter to muscle structure and function, we will learn more about how actin and myosin work together to produce contractions. So skeletal muscle gets its electrical stimulation, as we said, from the nervous system. Here you can see the axon terminal of a motor neuron releasing neurotransmitter onto a muscle fiber, which has a receptor for that neurotransmitter. Something about that interaction between neurotransmitter and receptor will produce electrical stimulation of the cell, and that is going to produce contraction. That's all the detail we really need to get into for now. So muscle contraction, as we are going to become acutely aware of, requires a startling amount of ATP. Muscle cells work harder than any other kind of cell in your body. So for that reason, each myocyte or muscle fiber must be nourished regularly with oxygen, substrates, and electrolytes, which of course are delivered through the bloodstream. So it's very important that we do a good job of delivering all of these nutrients to all cells throughout the body, but particularly muscle cells. Moving on to cardiac muscle, this is obviously exclusive to the heart, in which case the muscle is referred to as myocardium. Cardiac muscle does not receive its electrical stimulation from motor neurons in the nervous system. Rather, it derives its electrical stimulation from pacemaker cells, which are heavily modified muscle cells that are actually embedded within the heart itself. These pacemaker cells produce waves of electrical activity that are taken up by the other cardiomyocytes, the cardiac muscle cells, and then they spread everything around. However, the pacemaker cells themselves can receive messages from the central nervous system, and this can help to regulate how often these pacemaker cells fire, which helps us to regulate our heart rate, whether we need to increase it or decrease it. Cardiac muscle has some histological hallmarks, which includes also being striated, just like what we saw with skeletal muscle, but they have some unique hallmarks, including the presence of intercalated discs, a branching pattern of structure, and usually you will only see one nucleus per cell, so it's usually pretty easy to distinguish cardiac muscle from skeletal muscle. So the main thing we want to focus in on here is the intercalated disc. An intercalated disc is made up of a very high density of junction proteins between two neighboring cardiomyocytes. You can see the intercalated discs illustrated here. The most important junction protein that you will find in an in an intercalated disc is called a gap junction. A gap junction is basically a little tunnel that connects the cytoplasm of two neighboring cells and allows for small materials, which mostly includes ions, to move freely from the cytoplasm of one cell to the cytoplasm of the next cell. So what this is going to allow for is for cardiac muscle cells to pass electrical stimulation from cell to cell to cell so that they all get electrically excited at the same time, so then that they can all contract and relax together in a synchronous manner. So when the heart contracts and relaxes, it's really important that all the muscle fibers in a singular region do everything together at the same time. So one last thing that we'll go ahead and mention here is that we said that cardiac muscle fibers are also striated. So with skeletal muscle, I mentioned that this is because of the special organization of actin and myosin. So if cardiac muscle is also striated, that must mean cardiac muscle fibers have the same sort of organization that we saw in skeletal muscle. Finally, moving on to smooth muscle tends to be found in blood vessels, internal organs, and in the iris of the eye. So smooth muscle, when it contracts and relaxes, it can regulate the diameter of circular openings like the iris of the eye, like blood vessels, entryways into different parts of the digestive tract, or it can facilitate movement of materials. So a lot of the smooth muscle that you find in your GI tract, your esophagus, and other places, those produce waves of what is called peristalsis that helps to push digested materials along in one particular direction. So some histological hallmarks of smooth muscle is that smooth muscle is not striated, so it must not have the same sort of organization of actin and myosin. Even though smooth muscle does contain actin and myosin, the cells are spindle-shaped, they have a single nucleus, and they really, on the whole, as a tissue, lack any geometric organization that we took note of for skeletal and cardiac muscle. So, because smooth muscle is not striated, as I said before, we can conclude the actin-myosin organization inside these cells is different than what we're used to with cardiac and skeletal muscle. So, smooth muscle can have two different types of cellular arrangement at the tissue level. They can be arranged circularly, or they can be arranged longitudinally. How the organization works out is going to depend on where we're finding our smooth muscle. If we find it in the GI tract, it's most likely going to be longitudinal to produce those waves of peristalsis. If it's circular, it's more likely we're talking about the iris or a blood vessel. So we've talked a lot about where we derive our electrical excitation for these muscle fibers. For smooth muscle, the electrical excitation can either come from pace setter cells, which act a lot like pacemaker cells. These are found in the GI tract, and they allow for the rhythmic production of those peristaltic waves. Or, in other cases, the electrical excitation can come from the autonomic nervous system, which has its own set of motor neurons. And we'll look at a particular example of how this works with the iris of the eye. So there's a lot of detail in this illustration that is probably too early for us to really see, but the idea here is that the iris of the eye, which surrounds the pupil, which is just a hollow hole in the eye, the iris acts to kind of adjust the diameter of the pupil to help us regulate how much light is allowed to enter into the eye. So the contraction and relaxation of these iris smooth muscles, the circular muscles, and the blanking on the other names, so the circular muscles and the radial muscles, they are controlled by motor neurons which come from something called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system at the level of the brain is able to sense how much light we are exposed to, and then those autonomic motor neurons can send messages to the smooth muscle of the iris to allow them to open or close the pupil to help us regulate how much light is allowed to enter into the eye. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms that you probably ought to be aware of. And then for checking your understanding, number 1, how do the 3 types of muscle differ in terms of structure and function? Number 2, how does each type of muscle derive its electrical excitation? And number 3, what physiological purpose does each type of muscle serve? All right, that's going to do it for this video. If you have a question, go ahead and drop it in the comments section. I will see you next time.